Let's go ahead now and talk a little bit about the end of World War One. World War One was ended by the Treaty of Versailles, or as I like to call it, the worst treaty ever written. Ever. At least that's my contention. You can decide whether or not I'm right or wrong. The Treaty of Versailles, what actually was in it? Woodrow Wilson himself goes over to negotiate the treaty that ends World War One, and he has 14 things that he would like to see included in the treaty. They're called Wilson's 14 points. Some of them were designed to prevent further conflicts. Things like, hey, we don't want to keep any more secrets. We know how that worked out when Russia kept it secret that they were allied to Serbia. We want to allow for free trade, so no more sinking, passenger ships or merchant ships on the open seas. So everybody has free oceans. Everybody is allowed to trade with everybody. That was one of the things that brought the U.S. into the war. We want to go ahead and end the arms race so that if countries don't have these huge armies, maybe they'll be less likely to actually go to war in the first place. That was part of Wilson's thinking. And that colonial powers ought to care for their colonies, ought to go ahead and look out after them. Those are some of his 14 points. Another one of the big of his 14 points was the idea of self-determination, that countries should be allowed to decide for themselves, nationalities should be allowed to decide for themselves how they were to be governed. And that was something he hoped to get out of the treaty. Important to understand, what Wilson gets out of the treaty of his 14 points is exactly almost nothing. He really only gets one. And he sacrifices all 14 points, 13 of the 14, I should say, for one, the last point, the League of Nations. He felt that that was the most important. That was his crown jewel. That was the thing he wanted more than anything else. Because if he felt like if he got the League of Nations, he could work on all the other stuff bit by bit. So he was willing to sacrifice all of his 14 points in order to go ahead and form the League of Nations. And he does that. The Treaty of Versailles establishes the League of Nations. Who does he bring with him? Again, it's kind of odd because Wilson himself headed the delegation. Usually this was a job that was given to the Secretary of State. The presidents usually didn't take care of this themselves. But he has a problem. First, the delegation that he brings along with him includes only one Republican. Well, he was going to need Republican help if this thing was going to get ratified. It wasn't as if he completely controlled the legislature. And on top of that, he didn't bring any senators with him. Again, another huge problem. Because the body that is responsible for ratifying treaties in the United States and eventually approving them, the president negotiates them, but he doesn't get to approve them. That's the Senate. And without any senators along to ask, hey, what do you think about this idea? The senators, understandably, were a little bit miffed. And they didn't exactly want to go along with what Woodrow Wilson was trying to push on them. The treaty itself was negotiated by what were called the Big Four. Woodrow Wilson from the United States, Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Clemenceau, who was from France, and Orlando, who was from Italy. These were the four primary allies that won the war, and these were the four who sat down and basically drew up the treaty. Notice here that Russia's not included in this group. Well, wait a minute. Wasn't Russia one of the allied powers? Well, it was, but remember, Russia had already signed a treaty with Germany. They left the war early. So, okay, that makes sense. They weren't included. But that's going to get a little weird here in just a second. Also notice the Central Powers, which hadn't really originally decided to surrender unconditionally, were completely left out of the negotiating process. They had no say in what was going on. So these forced it down, and really, especially Clemenceau and George wanted to punish Germany. And so their idea behind the treaty was to just stick it to Germany. Wilson wants his 14 points. They want to stick it to Germany. They end up sticking it to Germany. But they do establish the League of Nations. It ends up being signed in June of 1919 after a lengthy negotiation process. So the results of the treaty. What did they agree to? Well, they agreed to form 9 new nations. They agreed to form Poland. They agreed to form Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Austria, Hungary, and Finland. Most of these countries come out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Poland had been a little part of Germany and also a little part of Russia. Wait a minute. Hadn't Russia already gotten out of this thing? Czechoslovakia had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Yugoslavia had been in part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were all Russian. But wait a minute. They already signed the treaty. Austria and Hungary, obviously part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Finland, which had also been part of Russia. Wait a minute. Russia wasn't there. And not only that, when they were there, didn't they fight on the side that won? How does the winner end up losing more territory than the losers? And that's what in effect happened. And in a treaty that didn't involve them at all, Russia ended up losing more territory than even the losers of the war. This understandably makes Russia a little bit upset, and it causes a lot of tension between Russia and Western Europe and the United States. Really, this is the beginnings, well, you can actually go back a little further, but some of the beginnings of what would eventually turn into the Cold War. Again, tracing right back to its roots to the Treaty of Versailles. You also had what were called mandates. Mandates were supposed to be colonies that were being prepared for independence. In the Middle East, you had things like Iraq and Kuwait and Jordan and stuff like that. In Southeast Asia, you had a little place called Vietnam. And again, all these places end up becoming future conflicts for us. The German punishment by far and away was probably one of the worst things that they did. They said Germany wasn't allowed to have a military. Germany had to agree to pay $54 billion in war reparations, which really they just finished paying off in the past year or two. And probably most significantly, Germany had to go ahead and agree that they were solely responsible for the war. They were the guilty party. They started the whole thing. Of course, as we know now, there's a problem there. Germany didn't start the whole thing. Austria and Serbia started the whole thing. Then Russia hopped in, and then finally Germany hops in just because it's honoring its treaty obligations. Germany wasn't at fault for the war, but the Treaty of Versailles said they were, and Germany had to accept that. That made the Germans angry, which is incredibly unfair to Germany. Again, completely ignoring the Serbian role in starting the war, the Allied readiness to become involved, and really those feelings of anger that it creates in Germans is what really sets the stage for Adolf Hitler. So in the seeds of this treaty, you have the seeds of the Cold War, you have the seeds of World War II. In Southeast Asia, there was a little guy who came to Woodrow Wilson and said, "Hey, Mr. Wilson, we really like what you're doing here. We think we should be our own country. We're in Southeast Asia. We're certainly not French. My name's Ho Chi Minh. Can we have a government like yours? Can we have a country like yours?" And Woodrow Wilson threw him out. And he turns rather to other places to gain support. And of course, we end up fighting a war in Vietnam, with Ho Chi Minh being the leader of the Vietnamese. So again, a lot of the conflict throughout the 20th century can trace its roots right back to the Treaty of Versailles. Absolutely one of the worst treaties ever written, not a doubt, in my mind at least. The Sudetenland, another problem with the Treaty of Versailles. The Sudetenland was an area of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they were German-speaking people, and they really wanted to be part of Austria. And instead, they were made part of Czechoslovakia. Again, this reflects a disregard for Germans. We didn't care what the Germans think. We didn't care what the Germans wanted. And this just plays, again, right into Adolf Hitler's hands. So the Sudetenland will be one of the first things that Adolf Hitler takes over leading into World War II. And so, again, you see the seeds of World War II being sown right here with the Treaty of Versailles. In the United States, we definitely don't like this treaty. The Germans don't like it because they're afraid it's too hard on Germany, and they were right. It was. Germany, basically, the Great Depression for Germany starts right after World War I. The Irish didn't like it because here Wilson says he's for self-determination. The Irish don't want to be part of Great Britain. They didn't get independence out of it. And a lot of people just felt like the treaty was just too harsh. They felt like it would only provide for further conflict because it didn't allow Germany to recover from the war. That sounds prophetic. And so they opposed the treaty on those grounds as well. Other people opposed the treaty because they didn't like this League of Nations thing. They didn't want to be involved in world affairs. That's a very old sentiment going all the way back to George Washington. And so they opposed the League of Nations because they felt that not only would we be able to influence things in West and in Europe, but they might actually influence things here. And is that not a violation of the Monroe Doctrine? Further, what if we didn't like it? What if we got into the League of Nations and we found out it wasn't in our interest and we wanted out? Was there some provision for getting out of the League of Nations? Would it bring Europeans involvement in our internal affairs? Would it affect the way we ran our country? And people were afraid of that. Would we have to be involved in world affairs? Would it get us involved in other countries' wars and draw us into other wars in the future? These were all questions that people had and reasons they were hesitant to sign on to the League of Nations. Henry Cabot Lodge was a conservative in the United States Senate who opposed ratification on a lot of these grounds and really led the fight to go ahead and not ratify the treaty. So Woodrow Wilson comes home and realizes his treaty's in deep trouble and he is getting ready to lose this thing. And so he goes ahead and he starts to campaign for the treaty. He starts to go around and he feels like if he could just give enough speeches, he was a gifted orator. And if he can talk to enough people, he can convince them this is a good idea. His doctor, after he comes home from negotiating the treaty, had been really stressful on him, says, "Hey, buddy, you're not in good shape. You really shouldn't do this." He ignores his doctor's advice. He goes on an 8,000-mile-long trip, gives 35 speeches in 22 days, and on October 2nd, 1919, he suffers a debilitating stroke. And he is unable to continue his campaign. The treaty is rejected. and we never go ahead and become a member of the League of Nations. The Senate rejects the treaty. We have to go back and negotiate our own treaty with Germany, which we do. And we never sign on to the Treaty of Versailles, which Woodrow Wilson negotiated. So go ahead and take a moment. Why don't you pause it and see if you can ask yourself a few questions and see how much you remember from what we just discussed. Thanks.